Hi, I'm Paul Johnson, and I'm with the Optimistic American. I'm happy to have you here today. We're going to talk a little bit about hope. On today's episode, we're going to have some fun. We're going to talk about good versus evil. We're going to talk about the addictive, or what I call the addictive ideologies. We're going to talk about forgiveness and love, the ability to begin anew. I'm here with Dr. Emily Bashah. Emily Bashah has helped us develop our 7 codes to try and help people navigate through these extremely divisive times and try and empower the human spirit as part of the process. Emily, welcome today.
Thank you. First off, Paul, I just want to say who this episode is for and who we're gearing this for. There are people who do suffer from severe psychological, psychiatric disorders, and we're not trying to minimize what they may be suffering from. As if to simplify and say, oh, it's just a change of your thought process or a change of your behavioral habits. It's not that simple for some people. And so what we're really gearing this towards is for people who feel stuck, who feel like they're somewhat trapped in these behavioral patterns, and they're not quite fulfilled. They feel like something really essential is missing from their life.
Okay. So with that, let me start with one of my own personal stories, because I think it ties right into that, the whole idea of feeling trapped and being in a position where you don't quite know what to do and how maybe taking control of things can begin to change the outcome of your life. My plan when I had left high school was that I was going to go to a great college. I was going to get a law degree and an MBA, and then I was going to go work on Wall Street. I was going to come back home and hopefully start a business and run for office.
Very ambitious.
I had this whole plan. It was all laid out in my mind. Literally, I'd been planning it since I first entered in high school. But
ready to conquer the world.
Ready to go, except all but for one thing. I found out at 17 years old that I was going to become a father. Now, I remember when I first found that out, I went to my dad and I talked to him about it because I was kind of stressed by it. My dad's a simple guy. He has usually pretty simple advice. But I said to my dad, I'm really struggling with this. And he said, well, what are you struggling with? I said, well, what do? I don't know what the right action is. He says, well, it seems to me like you have 2 choices. I said, okay, what do you think those choices are? He says, well, one choice is you make certain that you act like a father and you stand up and do the right thing and you take care of your child, whether it's a daughter or a son, that you take care of them. I said, all right, what's my other choice? He said, well, the other choice is there's going to be somebody running around in this world that thinks his dad's a piece of crap. Right? So
that's important perspective right there.
Yeah, it was an older perspective. Also, somebody who liked the idea of being a grandfather. I'm pretty sure he had his own interest in mind.
Yes.
But I took his advice. I ended up getting married. We had a baby. And before I say anything else, I will say this in case my son is listening to this. It was definitely the best decision that I ever could have made. But I ended up dropping out of school. I ended up having to go to work, and I had to take care of him because my dad's view was there wasn't going to be any subsidy. He wasn't going to pay for rent or give anything to anyone after they left his home. So I remember finding myself literally about a month into this where I'm out scraping floors for my dad behind a spray rig. Now, if you don't know what a spray rig is, it's this machine that shoots texture on the wall. It has a hose about the size of your fist, and that machine will shoot out texture at a very high rate with lots of moisture in it. Mm-hmm. It makes this incredibly loud sound as you're spraying it. The room will begin to fill with moisture. It's kind of a white moisture, so you can't really see far ahead of you. The hose is having to be yanked from room to room, hitting in the feet or the knees or whatever. The temperature might be 115 degrees outside, but by the time you put the plastic on the windows and you have all this humidity in the room, the heat almost becomes unbearable. And then you add that to a floor scraper.
I feel like I'm sweating just thinking about it.
You have this floor scraper where you're scraping this metal across the floor to get the texture up off of the floor. It just grates on your teeth. Well, in any event, I walked outside at the end of like the 3rd or 4th day of doing this. My dad saw me. He's out there cleaning a bucket, getting stuff ready to put on the truck. He said, hey, come on, let me go buy you an iced tea. So I said, all right. So I got in his truck. We drove down to this place called Bonanza. We sat down. I started drinking this iced tea that he bought me. And I remember I was kind of annoyed by him because the entire time I'm drinking this iced tea, he just keeps laughing, right? And I'm like, what is he laughing about, right? And I know that I'm not just stressed, I'm depressed, right? I've got a sick baby at home. The baby was born premature. It actually wasn't at home. It was at a hospital. I was newly married. We had no money. We were just in a tough spot. And so my dad says, all right, so what's the problem? I said, oh, Dad, there's no problem. He says, oh, come on, you've been moping around this job for the last 3 days. He goes, I know there's a problem. I said, okay. You want to know what the problem is? I go, Dad, I totally screwed up my life. And he said, okay, how's that? I said, how's that? I said, Dad, I had this plan to go to college and to get an MBA and to get a law degree and to maybe run for office one day. And instead, I'm out here scraping floors behind you. So my dad said, look, I can't fix all that stuff. He says, but I can tell you, I can make your life better. I guarantee you I can help you make your life better. I said, okay. He says, well, if I give you the advice, will you take it? I said, well, sure. What is it? He goes, no, I want a promise from you that you'll take it. I said, okay, Dad, I promise. If you give me advice, I will take it. He says, all right, when you go in tomorrow, he said, I want you to run out of that truck as we go from house to house. I want you to pull that hose out. I want you, when you're scraping floors, race the person next to you. He says, I want you telling them how much you love these conditions, how much you love this heat, how much fun you're having, right? I didn't know that I could do it, but I said, all right, Dad, I'll give it a try. So the next day, sure enough, that's what I do. I'm yanking out the hose. I'm getting the stuff set up. I'm getting the Bisqueen on the windows. The thing starts spraying. I start scraping the floors. And I realized right away I scraped the floor in one room like twice as fast as the guy next to me. And I'm going, come on, what's going on? All right. Start getting a little bit annoyed. And over time, they started complaining about the heat and the humidity and everything else. And I just started saying what my dad had said. Man, I love it when conditions are like this. Now, here's what's interesting. It didn't take long. In doing that, where number one, the first thing that happened is the day passed much quicker. The second thing, before a long period of time, I was running the spray rig. Didn't take long. I was the guy who actually was in business. And it didn't take even much longer, and I got to run for office. All those things that I thought that I had lost, I actually didn't lose any of them. They all came about over a period of time.
And those conditions were also building your character, and it was a test of your character, letting you know what you were also made out of, that you can rely on that when you're looking back on it. Sorry to interrupt you, but one of the main things that I just recall you saying that I thought is important to highlight, when you're confronted with stress, you'll say, no problem, and you smile and you say, bring it on. I'm not afraid of going back to the trailer. And I just think that is so dang powerful.
Yeah, well, once you grow up in a trailer and you start to realize that people loved one another and that you had a good time, you start to recognize that it's actually not that bad of an existence. But the point that I guess I was going to give to you is by changing my mindset, I changed my destiny. There's just no doubt about it. I took control over my own life, and it began to have an effect on the things that were around me.
And you had to lose yourself to find yourself.
Oh, there are just so many lessons from it. And for the rest of my life, whenever something would be going bad, I would always compare it to that scraping of floors. And I would think, well, if I could live through the scraping of floors, I can live through whatever this problem is. Now, here's my question for you. You have dealt with terrorists. You've dealt with prisoners, people who are on death row. You've dealt with all different types of people, doing evaluations of them psychologically. Is this true for everyone? Does everyone have the ability to change their life in that way if they so will it?
So just to clarify the question, I think, the question here is, can people change their states of mind? Do they have the capacity to grow, to reflect on their experiences, to dramatically change the course of where their life is headed based on what they're foreseeing for themselves? And can they change their habits or their compulsions or their obsessions? Absolutely, 100%. I wouldn't be in the business I am if I didn't believe that.
Everyone can?
No. That's what I want to clarify. So no, everyone cannot. And there are obviously limitations. People with really serious mental disorders, physical disorders. There's all kinds of conditions or illnesses and disabilities that may restrict and limit people so severely that their optimal growth may be more limited or constrained than maybe somebody else who has more options. But, I've worked with so many different kinds of people. One often common story that comes up with a lot of defendants that I'm evaluating in jail is a horrific childhood. They talk about a childhood where the people who were supposed to protect them and shield them and guide them and support them and love them were their abusers in horrific forms of abuse, not just physical abuse, but their sexual abuse and neglect and to all the severe forms of it. And yet here they are, and they're confronted with their own inner demons, and they also get to hit that T intersection in the road and say whether or not do they want to continue down the same path and enforce the same trauma on others, become the oppressor that they were oppressed by, because that's what often happens with trauma. And fortunately, there are people in my line of work, I get to witness it on their journey, that they find the hope in despair. And they find the meaning in their trauma.
Even while in prison?
And their purpose, absolutely. So I'll tell you a story of a person I'll call Gentle Jim in order to maintain anonymity and alter some of the details of his story. So he was a minor, and he ended up committing a murder in what seemed like a heat of passion in an argument that escalated with somebody who was abusing him and was an adult male. And he ended up being sentenced to as a juvenile, life in prison without the opportunity for parole. So he's looking at life in prison, and that will likely remain the same. This is a person, he's quite large-framed, it's kind of a massive stature, but yet so gentle and non-intimidating. He was so respectful and cooperative and kind, and even talking to the detention officers, they say how helpful he is to the other inmates. And he personally took pride in helping a lot of the younger inmates who were coming in for the first time in adult facilities. He was on the lowest class security in general population. He took advantage of all the education and courses and trainings and certifications one could. He's an exemplary prison inmate, if there is such a thing, and there is. But what was so awesome and inspiring for me was that he had wisdom, he had insight, he had remorse. He was taking responsibility and accountability for his actions. He questioned, how did I get there? There wasn't a day that he lived that he didn't feel guilt and remorse for the crime that he had committed. He recognized the victims who had been harmed, and yet he turned all of that around. He could have been a hateful, vengeful, spiteful person, and that would have been legitimate. His childhood was horrific. I can't even say if I had lived a childhood similar to a lot of the people I evaluate that I would really be any different. It would be so hard. But yet it's so inspiring when you see these people turn that corner and change their life for themselves. And he's living a meaningful life, regardless of the situation of him remaining to be in prison. So that is inspirational.
How is his life meaningful?
He's helping other people. He is contributing to a community and has a sense of belonging and provides mentorship for young males entering into the juvenile justice system.
Interesting. Yeah, that reminds me of Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
Oh, I love him, yes.
Yeah, the Gulag Archipelago. He wrote this book while he was in the Gulag, but he actually did it in his mind. I think he didn't write the first manuscript until after he left, something like 2,100 pages.
That's impressive.
But here's a guy who was sent by Russia to the German front, to the Western Front. Mm-hmm. He fought with the Germans. I believe he served in a German prisoner of war camp, and the Germans treated the Russians dramatically different because the Russians hadn't bought into the whole idea that prisoners needed to be treated fair, so the Germans didn't treat them so fair. In fact, many of the people who talk about it who were Americans that were in these prisons that were next to them said that it was just absolutely brutal conditions. But when he got out, he had written a letter back to someone in his family that said something negative about the Politburo. Somehow or another, obviously, that got back to the Politburo. When they were done, they sentenced him to another 10 years in the Gulag. Mm. Before he went to the Gulag, though, one of his jobs was to deal with a group of people called the Kulaks. And what's interesting about Alexander's journey is that while he was in the Gulag, he decided that instead of focusing on the things that had been done wrong to him, that he needed to first focus on the things that he had done wrong. Now, keep in mind, these gulags, he called them the Archipelago because they were like the islands. They were spread out all over Russia. They weren't just simply in one area. But literally, he believed that somewhere around 1 in 6 Russians from the 1917 to the 1950s actually went to the Gulag, and we know that about 25% of those died. His estimates are it's as high as 60 million, but even if it's 30 million, half of his number, it's such a huge number. There's just not been an atrocity, maybe other than China, that's been committed. Even Hitler's atrocities, as terrible as they were, don't reach those types of numbers.
I remember seeing those mounds of people similar to what you would see in the Jewish Holocaust, where, they're just really bones and skin and just piles of bodies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a horrific experience. Mm-hmm. But when he did an account of his life, he talked about how these kulaks that were small farmers that owned their own property, how they didn't want to buy into communism. Communism and the theory of dialectic materialism believes that you need to control the means of production. And to control the means of production in farming, you have to own the land. So their job was to go take the land from them, and these were people who just didn't want to give it up voluntarily. So first, they forcibly took it away from them. And then, of course, what they need to do is to shut them up, because they're not going to be a happy group of people. So they sent tens of millions of these people into Siberia and into the gulags. One of the groups that he had dealt with was a town of about 10,000 families, somewhere around 60,000 people, and he pointed out that all of them perished. They all died. Now, what I love about his story is that he talks about the whole idea of good versus evil. He believed that if you took the best person in the world, there was still a little bit of evil in them. And if you took the worst person in the world, there was still a little bit of good in them. That each one of us have good and evil that runs through us. And that what ideology does, ideology begins to allow you to, for people to escape their own accountability by creating good guys and bad guys based upon the ideology. So sometimes it's the rich. The rich people are the people who are the problem. Sometimes it's the immigrants, as Adolf Hitler had done. But either way, whichever one you pick, you begin to shift this mindset of who's good versus they're evil and we're good. He talked about how that ideology began to allow people to do things that they shouldn't have done. Now, what's fascinating about the Gulag Archipelago is it survived the Soviet Union. In fact, in many respects, I think it was one of the leading reasons why the Soviet Union came down. First, as other countries began to read this manuscript, they knew that they didn't want to take part in what had taken place in Russia, but it also began to have an effect on people internally in Russia.
Wow, so fascinating. There's so much there to unpack. I think one of the main things that you're saying that's resonating with me and is relevant to our topic is looking at the harm that an ideology perpetuates and the risk of it legitimizing, murdering, terrorizing, harming another group of people and creating some kind of differentiation between us versus them, just as you described. So I wanted to also talk about existentialism in terms of the history of psychology.
They're definitely connected.
Yes. So existentialism, as defined by Viktor Frankel, who I'll tell you about his life story in a moment, it really defines existentialism as finding meaning and purpose, not necessarily happiness, is the spirit and the goal of one's life pursuit, that there is this life instinct that lives within us and that we have free will. No one can take that from you, even if you're imprisoned, even if you're in the gulags, even if you're in the Holocaust in a concentration camp, which he was a survivor. That no one can deprive you of that. And if you have that will to live, that surpasses so many other conditions that you think one cannot physically survive. And that's what he witnessed while he was surviving. He was in Auschwitz and some other camps for 3 years.
Frankel was.
Viktor Frankel. his family perished. His father died in a ghetto. His mother and brother died in Auschwitz. His sister, fortunately, was able to escape to Australia. And he was an Auschwitz survivor. And he was in camps for the full 3 years. By the time he was released, he returned home, and he's Austrian. By the time that he returned home in Vienna, he saw that all of his family members, nobody was there. They all perished. His whole community was non-existent. And he was really confronted with a life crisis, an existential crisis. And so he started to immerse himself in his work. I should have mentioned before, he was a psychiatrist and a neurologist before they took him into the concentration camp. And he committed himself to understanding this existential phenomena that was happening, that he was witnessing. And he just dedicated himself even further and developed a theory called logotherapy, which was Greek translated for healing through meaning. And he said, this is really the work that we're meant to do. He came to America, and he was actually challenging the independence, the pursuit of happiness, the language in the Declaration of Independence about the pursuit of happiness, saying, this is valuable. We shouldn't be a nation that is striving for happiness. We should be striving for collectively finding meaning and purpose.
Although I do think that Thomas Jefferson, when he wrote those words, he actually replaced life, liberty, and property with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think what he actually meant by that was the same thing. He was saying that that different people derive their sense of meaning from different things. Some from being a farmer, others from writing music, others from creating an invention. And that whatever it was that brought them to that happiness, that was their meaning, they owned it, and you couldn't take it from them. But I think the point's still well taken that meaning should be more important than happiness. And I think oftentimes Americans misunderstand what that happiness meant.
Yes, yeah. And, happiness is really an inside job. Mm-hmm. And I work with my clients talking to them about this. What is it when you hit there? You'll have that aha moment and recognizing where you've been living your life astray from what your sense of purpose and your spiritual drive is really wanting and feeling unsatisfied. So Viktor Frankel was researching and coined the term existential vacuum. And he was saying and theorizing that people who are led to addictions, alcoholism, depression, suicide, anxiety, and despair, neuroses, all these other things are really driven because there is this existential vacuum that people are seeking to have depth and quality and purpose in their life. And they may not know it. They might be in denial, and then they're filling this void with other things. And the other person I wanted to mention is Carl Jung.
Very much along the same lines as Solzhenitsyn.
Yes, and so he's a psychoanalyst, and he started to research and developed these different archetypes. And there's the persona, there's the self, there's the anima and animus, and there's the shadow. And I think for what we're talking about here, this nature and this instinct, this death instinct and also life instinct that lives within us all, and this good versus evil duality that is constantly in conflict with us all, Jungian analysis really helps to pave the road to dissect and analyze that for oneself. And he says, good and evil are within us. Don't fool yourself to thinking that you're all one or another, because otherwise you're just suppressing that other part of you without really appreciating the depth of it. And the instinctual, primitive sense can be very self-destructive if it's overfed. And so you need to find that middle path. Mm-hmm. And through self-actualization and working on the inner self, uncovering the self, through this self-discovery process. It's really a quest. It's an honorable, noble quest to do this. And we're so externally focused. I think one of the recommendations that we're giving is really take the time to look inwards.
It's when you think about this as applied to today, we can look at the extreme factions of both parties. The extreme factions, certainly from an ideological standpoint, are probably the people who believe in the white patriarchy, that the entire system is rigged against anybody other than white men, and so we need to displace white men because of that, or people who believe in white nationalism, who believe that we ought to be displacing everybody else. Those two ideas are extreme, and you can see how those both lead to the damage not only of other individuals, but it also leads to the damage of the individual who's purporting that particular measure. It's not often as clear for people who don't buy into those two theories, but you'll hear it sometimes. People saying, well, I don't want anything to do with anybody who's a Democrat, or I don't want anything to do with anyone who is a Republican. If you've begun to get your ideology confused with your relationships, you're headed down the wrong path. You're allowing your ideology to begin to utilize that sense of evil that is in each one of us to cloud your better judgment. You just shouldn't be giving up on people that you love and people that you care about for people that you don't even know. And it happens so often. I mean, we watch it on Facebook, this whole term of friends and like. That in itself those are powerful words that are used for people that you really care about. Usually the people who are on Facebook or on other social medias, they're not really their friends. They're not really people they like. They're just people that they're agreeing with on some ideological strain. And unfortunately in that process, oftentimes people will say and do things because they're not in a face-to-face environment that will harm other people. And it's just not necessary. But it also is the indication that you're beginning to put ideology above the other person. To me, you've got to start with love.
Yeah, and that goes back to, what we were talking about in the other episode about the risks of dehumanization. So, Paul, you're a strong advocate for loving other people and love your customer when it comes to business. But how do you define love? It's such a complex question.
Yeah, well, I guess it's a fair question to say, can you love somebody you don't even know, right? And my answer to that question is absolutely you can. I mean, imagine this. Imagine in 9/11, these firefighters who went up into the two towers. One of the towers fell. The firefighters who were in the top floors of the other one knew that their building was going to fall as well. So they began running down the set of stairs. On the way down, they would open up the doors to try to clear the floor. They opened up one of the doors, and sure enough, there were a group of older, handicapped people inside this room. Why? Well, because they'd been moved there so the other people who could get down the stairs faster could get down them and save more people. But these firefighters, they couldn't do that. So they took these people out of that room and began to do the best that they could to carry their wheelchairs, to take them arm in arm, and to take them down the stairs. Now, as it turns out, a little bit of luck happened. That was the blessing in disguise. It was a blessing in disguise because that building did collapse, but the stairway didn't. Well, it collapsed, but it didn't collapse all the way.
Survived.
And many of those people survived. Most of those firefighters probably wouldn't have survived had they not have stopped to grab those people. But that is definitely an act of love. I don't think you could see it any other way. When I talk to my employees, we own a healthcare company, and I can tell you that when we talk to our employees, if you are a diabetic and you need insulin, the idea that when you call our office, we get a script out for you and make certain that it's available for you, that's our job. That's what we're supposed to do. But oftentimes, the person on the other end of the line, they can't physically get to the place to pick up the insulin, or they don't have the ability to pay the copayment. If it were your parent, you would ask them those questions. Do you have a ride there? Can you get there to pick it up? Do you have the money to be able to pay for the copayment? Now, when we love them, if they don't have those things, we find a way to fix it because we care about them as human beings. absolutely, you can love people that you don't know. I think the whole concept of love, I'm fascinated by this idea that literally every cell within our body is going to disappear within a 7-year period of time. Your muscle cells disappear in about 90 days. It's all going to be regenerated. And literally, not a thing that you can touch on yourself is going to be here 7 years from now. But somehow your conscience is still going to be here, your memories, your thoughts. That says to me that there's something more about us than simply our flesh and blood. Now, again, these are concepts that Martin Luther talked about, that Jean Rousseau, the Frenchman, spoke about, that the Greeks talked about in Themos, but there's something special inside of each one of us. Whatever you want to call that, you can call it the human spirit, you can call it a soul, you can just call it a conscience. There's something in us that goes beyond that. And when you can find the ability to connect to another human being at that level, to connect that inner portion of you to that inner portion of them that goes beyond the flesh, that goes beyond the physical, that goes beyond money, that's love.
And there are so many different forms and facets of love. I think with the firefighters, the word that comes to mind is a selfless love. They're not thinking about, well, how is this going to be self-serving? They're going in there and providing an honorable duty with courage and bravery, and not even thinking about, should I hesitate because I might not survive this? They're going in there full force, 100%.
And it's an act of love. And an
act of selflessness.
And that may be part of the discussion. Sometimes love just isn't about, it isn't just about that connection between you and the other person, but it's a state of thinking. It's a state of mind.
Yeah, and researchers have attempted to grapple with this question. Sternberg's triangular theory of love really looked at romantic forms of love and saw that there were 3 essential factors, and that's intimacy, passion, and commitment and decision-making. So when you have that physical attraction for somebody, and also that intimacy and connection, that you're really building that trust and openness, empathy, understanding, creating shared meaning, and also shared goals and decision-making. You're involving each other in this process of living a life together, building a life together. And then there's been other research that has looked at attachment styles. And we see these in mammals, not just humans, that there are early forms of attachment, which are essential for the infant and the caregivers. And when those bonds are formed, it really is the building blocks for one's future relationships with other people and how they see other people, how they relate to other people, what they draw upon from other people. Do they see them as threatening, or are they more trusting and open? Do they have an anxious attachment style or an avoidant attachment style or secure attachment style? So these are all some different things that can add to building relationships and what is love. There's also that companionship kind of love. It doesn't necessarily have to be based on those other things. And so there are these different forms. There's also compassion and empathy that somebody can feel for another without even knowing them. You can just experience what they might be going through just through their facial features and their expression and what they're sharing. So there's all these different forms. I mean, it's fascinating. I think the main thing that we're trying to say here is, recognizing what gifts you have to give. And when we look at these different heroic deeds, they could be so subtle, but they're there and they exist. And I think if you're open to them, if you're experiencing gratitude for them, but that you're just not expecting to receive from other people, but you're really asking, what can I give in this situation? It changes somebody's outlook on life. Just as I was talking about that story about Gentle Jim. And we do find this in research. When people see that they have a role to play in other people's lives, that they derive this sense of satisfaction and fulfillment that, oh, I did something good for somebody. I helped somebody else. Somebody else got somewhere because of me. And I can't tell you how many people have helped me to get to where I've got. There's no way, shape, or form that I would ever be that kind of person that would say, oh, I'm self-made. That doesn't exist. It's just, they're so, my ancestors, I stand on their shoulders, as I talked about their story last time. But I think all of these are really critical. The other thing that I've been seeing in therapy is, people are in conflict because of their ideologies. And you had talked about this before. And I am seeing this, a lot of family dynamics and conflicts happening in the households because of where they stand politically. And here we are talking about, people that you love and people that you're committed to. What are your thoughts on that, Paul?
Well, I start with this. Within each one of us is the capacity for good and evil. It's there. Ideology becomes an excuse to be able to mistreat other people. There's just no doubt about that. The question becomes when you recognize that, when you recognize that you've been doing that, can you start over? Can you begin anew? And I think everything that I've seen and read says that, in fact, you can. But then the question becomes, well, what, again, is love and why does it exist? I always think about the whole concept that, why did God allow evil to exist in the first place? Right? If he's God, you would think that he could have wiped it out. And I'm sure that there are many people who suffered through Holocaust that question that same thing. Why would he allow this to exist? The only thing that I can come to is that he allowed it to exist because he gave us the right to have freedom of choice. He gave us the right to be able to choose kind of our own destiny. Now, if that in fact is the true, if free will was important, the question then is why? Well, I think because you can't love unless you do it freely, unless you had the choice to be able to do that. It all comes down, to me, to this whole concept of love. In the next section, we're going to talk about different things that you can do to try to deal with addictive ideologies and what you can do to be able to begin anew. But I think that you have to start with this whole concept that you have to put love over hate.
Yes, and I'd love to end with a quote, loving your enemies, that Martin Luther King Jr. Had stated. And, only love can drive out hate. Hate cannot drive out hate. And I think that is so powerful if you think about loving your enemies.
All right, Emily, what I'd like to do now is I'd like to try to talk about maybe some of the solutions to try to give people just a little bit more meat. But before we do, let me ask this question. Do you think, when you think about addiction, that people can be addicted to something more than alcohol or substances?
Absolutely. There are sexual disorders, gaming and gambling addictions, addictions to food, addictions to exercise. There are addictions to social media.
How would you define addiction?
So it's where it's involuntary and you don't have any sense of control. And in psychology, we use the terms obsessions and compulsions to help differentiate what's happening in the mind versus what the actions are. So obsessions really are those intrusive thoughts. They're involuntary. You really have no sense of control over them. And the compulsions are really there to try and equalize and find some kind of balance. But it could lead to very severe disorders. So to answer your question, yeah, it's something that's involuntary, outside of your control.
Yeah, I like the definition that says in simple manner that that it's something that you like, but that is doing long-term harm to you and that you can't stop, right? And in that case, I think ideology can be an addiction. I think that almost all forms of ideology can be addictive.
Yes, I'm glad that you brought that up. And there's emerging research in this area. And just to add to your point and definition of addiction, in psychology, whenever we define something as a disorder, we look for the functional impairment. If there is no functional impairment, like people can, eat and drink and have sex, but not to those degrees in severity and intensity to where it's causing harm or that functional impairment piece. And so we can look to addictions of ideology and see, okay, what is the impairment that's happening here? And there are mechanisms that we look at to see that puts people at risk for being indoctrinated. And so these are loneliness, disconnection, having no sense of belonging or a sense of community or a commitment to something. And
even denial is oftentimes people who are addicted to ideology are in denial that they are.
As are alcoholics at times, who are in the heart of their addiction, also in a matter of denial. So there are the different stages of change, and we have different models to help us move people through these different stages of change. But denial is a real strong function to keep people in the heart of what is going on for them.
So, when probably one of the greatest programs that I've ever had a chance to be involved with, I've had a number of people who I really cared about who went through Alcoholics Anonymous, the 12-step program, and I went through Al-Anon. But I also read what they call their big book. It's a book written by a guy named Bill. I love the story. By the way, it's a book that was written a very long time ago. But the 12 steps have been very, very effective. What's the view of psychology on the 12-step program or on that whole concept?
Yeah, there's been, a wealth of benefit that people have personally found. And there's been some research that have really highlighted, what are the main factors that are really assisting people in recovery here and also maintaining abstinence from mind or mood altering substances. So, not going in any particular order here, but focusing on the problem and really identifying what that problem is. You have to confront that addiction head on, and you cannot equally be in denial at the same time. So it forces you to confront your demons, essentially. There's also this piece of surrendering where you're really giving up power and recognizing that you are powerless over the addiction. And so the 12-step program talks about surrendering to a higher power, surrendering to God. It could be surrendering to a spiritual notion, or just even having the belief that there is something greater than yourself that you are connected to, and even greater than life itself. There's a mutual benefit that happens with attending groups and seeing people in their vulnerability also along that same journey, and then also attaining sponsorship. And so you're having people who are mentoring you along the way, and that you're also committed to this group, that you're also giving back to community. And that really helps to pull people in and hold them accountable and responsible for their recovery program. There's also this sense of increasing self-awareness, as well as a sense of self-worth that helps to combat shame. And as you were talking about earlier, in the heart of a lot of addictions, there's trauma. And so trauma and shame can coexist. And if you're not really confronting that and rebuilding yourself and taking the time to put into healing yourself, having that sense of community is really going to support that person move along that path. So you're also examining your own errors and character defects, and also self-acceptance and transformation is where we ideally want to go.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that the idea of a higher power is important or necessary?
Yes. I've seen it also in the clients that I work with, and there's also a lot of research on the benefits of having a kind of spirituality. It doesn't have to necessarily be that you believe in God. It can be a higher power. It can be nature. It could be that there is some kind of shared existence and meaning and purpose to your life. But having that belief system, has shown to be very beneficial, especially as people are no longer filling those voids and that emptiness with those addictions. They're left with this openness. And so what are they going to fill that with?
Yeah, there's some some social scientists who are now writing about this concept of the loss of believing that you're connected to some type of higher power ends up resulting in you creating a substitute. Now, that substitute can be government, but it can also be an ideology, because the ideology gives you a sense of belonging, a sense of you're a part of something
and
bigger.
And a sense of a cause.
And a sense of a cause, right? And
that
to
you're
me,
fighting for something that matters.
That higher power, however you define that. I mean, I have my own way of defining it, and to me, that's personal how I define it. But recognizing that you're a part of something bigger is an incredible part to it. I also think, though, that it's important that that we focus on examining our past errors and that we make amends for them. I love Solzhenitsyn, where he just simply makes the decision that he is not going to just focus on what Stalin did wrong or what the government did wrong. After he had served in the war, after he had done all the right things, they put him into a concentration camp for 10 years, and instead he starts by examining himself. If you cannot examine yourself, you cannot get your way through this. And by doing that, he was able to make amends and truly begin to look at the effects that the ideology had on him.
But this requires vulnerability, Paul. And I remember asking you that question earlier. You said you promised that you would come back to it. Don't think I didn't note that. So in your own life, what's been vulnerable for you? What are your thoughts on vulnerability? How have you derived strength and courage from confronting your own vulnerability and also past regrets? Not that you have them. I know that.
Yeah, well, no, I definitely have some past regrets. I start with this. Is there evil inside of me? Look, I've been divorced twice. That says to you something. Right? I guarantee you very few, if any, divorces happen that are one-sided. I've been divorced twice. And it's in general been because I put things in front of the things that I cared the most about, right? Meaning I allowed jobs and my company or my politics or other things to be more important than the people who I really cared the most about. I didn't give them the attention that they needed. Now, I think that I made some right decisions in that process. The right decisions that I made in that process is that when the divorce happened, I took more than 50% of the blame. I tried to listen to what the other person had to say. I didn't blame them. I didn't allow hatred to absorb me. I found a way to not only forgive them, but to forgive myself in the process. And I tried to work my way through it with love.
Yeah, and at times we can have competing values, and when we're in the moment, we can sometimes be hit with some blind spots, and then be blindsided later on to realize, what we had missed. And it's hard, especially if something's been destroyed, to go back to heal it and restructure it. But it forces us to grow and to become stronger in spite of it. And that's, the healing from trauma, the post-traumatic growth that we often advocate for. And
well, here's what I can tell you. I can tell you that in looking back on that, my first wife, Krista, after we had a divorce, she left, and pretty much most of the financial assets that we had, she ended up with in that process. And by the way, she deserved them. She spent 25 years with me, did a great job of raising our kids. I don't have any angst about what happened in that. But what I can tell you is that after moving in with another person, and they bought a farm, which was kind of her dream, when the assets ran out, the two of them ended up splitting up. And she came back to Phoenix. She didn't have, at the time, the Obamacare hadn't passed, so if you didn't have health care coverage and you had a pre-existing condition, you couldn't get it. So I helped pay for the chemo. And what I can tell you is that when she passed away, I was sitting there with her two boys, also with my current wife, holding her hand, and she was even asked, "Would you like us all to leave?" And she said, "Oh, please don't." You couldn't give me back all of that money in trade for that moment, right? I think that you have to take a look at what is the long-term effect, and even when you mess up, even when you make a mistake, even when you didn't do the things that you should have done for 25 years. You still have the chance to try to change today, and to try to find love.
So, Paul, tell me something.
All right.
Do you think that you have the right to be happy?
Oh my gosh, we're going to keep getting into my feelings here.
Yes, we are. I'm not letting you escape.
I guess not. Happy. First, I think that's even hard to define what that means. I like the definition that I believe that Thomas Jefferson put on it, right? That it's really more about your meaning. What are the things that mean something to you? Here's what I know. There are times in your life no matter what you do, you're going to be unhappy when your parents pass away. If something happens to somebody in your family that you love, you lose your job, those things are going to make you unhappy. But even in unhappiness, you can find meaning. If you focused your life on what is the meaning of your life, you can find your way through those unhappy periods of time.
Yes, absolutely. And that's so much in line with existentialism, who says, find meaning in the suffering. And your only way out is through. And there's this notion that we have free agency and free will to determine ourselves. The self-determinism isn't based upon our set of circumstances that we're born into, but it's about what do we create given the confines that life has given us. We're not saying that the life that was handed to each and every one of us is welcoming. Mm-hmm. For many people, it is not. I see people who were abused extremely by the people who should have loved them the most in this world. And, so how do those people find a sense of purpose and self-love and that sense of self-worth? That has to be rebuilt within them. And so existentialism says there is hope in despair. Mm-hmm. And so I'm really beckoning that people engage in this quest of self-discovery.
Did you ever see the movie Slumdog Millionaire?
Great movie, yes.
Yeah.
I love it.
I love the scene where the little boy is the two brothers, one who's just unhappy in his life, and then the younger brother who always seems to find happiness. Well, the younger brother goes into a J-John, and the older brother locks him in when he recognizes that some guy who's an actor, this little boy's idol, is going to show up, and that he would get a chance to get his picture. So he locks him in the J-John so he can't get out. Well, the actor lands with his helicopter. The little boy hears him out there, and he can't get out of the door. He's shaking the door, doing everything that he can. So he finally looks down into the hole of the J-John and realizes that's his only way out. So he dips into this bucket of crap, leads his way out, comes out with sludge all over him, but he runs with the biggest smile up to that actor because he's going to get his signature, right? The older brother is so dismayed and disheartened by the fact that his little brother can still be happy. It didn't make him any happier to try to make his younger brother more miserable. And when his younger brother wasn't more miserable, it even made him worse. At the end of the day, it's inside of us. Solzhenitsyn, that's part of what he says in his book. It's not the external factors. It's the internal factors where we find happiness. Now, in my opinion, you have to start by asking, what do I want? All right,
Yes.
I mentor as a volunteer. I don't get paid for it, but I mentor a lot of entrepreneurs and people who run for office, and they'll always come to me with a problem. And I always try to start by saying, what do you want? And then I ask them, why? Why do you want that? Mm-hmm. And in general, the why that they will give you the first couple of times, it's not the real why. There's something that's much deeper that you have to be able to uncover. But once they figure out what do they want and why they want it, then you have to get to the next question, which is, all right, how do I get it? And I believe this. Mm-hmm. You put together a plan. You put that plan out into the universe. And when you do that, it's amazing how things begin to happen that help you implement that change, that help you implement that plan.
Mm-hmm. So maybe a better way to put this is, what are your inner truths? Mm-hmm. Sounds like that's what you're really getting at with your mentees.
Oh, I think that I think you cannot live a lie. Mm-hmm. And I can't tell you how many people that I have found that have tried to. It almost always fails. You have to come to the truth about who you are and what it is that you want and what it is that's really driving you. And finding that truth, it's one of the great parts of our lives, is being able to find it. But it's the truth about our jealousies, our insecurities, about our sexuality, about the things that make us wake up in the morning and want to make things happen, and the things that we want in life. And again, I believe that if you keep this positive environment, this optimistic attitude, that you're able to implement change in places and in ways that very few other people can, simply because when you put it out into the universe, it just comes back to you.
Well, let's think about this. So, are you saying that that things are preordained or destined? And if that is the case, then think about the victims of the Holocaust. Are you saying that they deserved what had happened to them? That they weren't good people? Because bad things happened to them. Is it because they were doing bad things? I don't think that's necessarily.
Yeah, my guess is that's a question that a lot of philosophers asked and a lot of rabbis asked back then, and my answer to that is absolutely not. There are things that happen in the external world that you do not control. You do not have control. No matter how positive you are, how negative you are, there are things that are going to happen outside of you that you have zero control over. The fact that a despot gains control of your government, the fact that an asteroid hits the planet, the fact that a disease, AIDS, when it took place, none of those are the fault of people acting wrong or bad. But there is something where you can begin to affect your fate. One of my favorite stories, I don't know if you ever read the books by Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, but one of my favorite stories was the story of Ulysses. Now, Ulysses is on this ship, and he's on this great adventure. By the way, one of my favorite poems of all time comes from that particular book. But as he's going through this narrow pass, Cyclops comes up, and Cyclops is trying to stop him, and he can't see Ulysses because of the fog. So Ulysses takes his spear, and when he gets up close, he jams the spear right into Cyclops' eye, and he blinds him. But Ulysses can't help himself. He yells out his name, "I am Ulysses." Well, not only did Cyclops hear that, but so did his cousin. I believe his cousin was Poseidon, right? And Poseidon then made a decision that he wanted revenge. So he goes to Zeus to try to extract his revenge, and Zeus won't let him kill him because he still has this destiny. But he lets him hold him up on this island for 10 years, to not get back to his family, to not get back to the things that he cares about. I think that story, which is one of the oldest books that we have, is the story of destiny and fate, and how those two things are uniquely different.
Yes.
There's a destiny that's happening around us. If an asteroid hits, you didn't have anything to do with it. You could have willed it to the end of the universe, and it wouldn't have happened nor not happened because of what you willed. But how you reacted when it hit, if you survived, that is something under your control. Ulysses was so full of hubris, so full of wanting to make certain that everyone knew that it was him that had slayed this god or that had blinded this god, that he had to yell out his name. Well, for that hubris, there's a price that you have to pay. And that's up to you. That's the decision that you make. And that's the role that you play in determining it. And that's fate as opposed to destiny.
So it seems to me that sometimes we're resting on a higher power. Can you talk more about that?
Well, I think that the higher power is destiny. The higher power is something that just goes beyond us. Look, I have my own religious beliefs. I believe that there is a hand of God that's at play, and I believe that hand of God that is at play also. While it's determining our destiny, it still allows us the freedom of choice. Man, that's a complex thing, right? I've struggled with this very concept. How is it that God could allow evil? Think about this concept. If he allowed evil, if he allowed what happened in the Holocaust to happen, then he must have part of him that is evil. It's just a very complex, difficult concept to struggle with.
Yeah, I remember when I went to a concentration camp and toured it, I remember seeing somebody inscribed on the wall that it said, "If there is a God, he will have to beg for my forgiveness." And it just really helps to question that, how is that possible? And
at least for me, coming to a reckoning with that concept, I had to get to the idea that, well, he decided to allow free choice, right? And why? Why did he allow free choice? Well, then I think about things like love. Love is an amazing concept, but here's what I know about love. Without free choice, it doesn't exist. You can't love someone and be forced into it. You love someone because you freely choose to love them. Now, I love the comment that was made by Martin Luther King where he talks about love as a state of mind.
And to love your enemy.
And to love your enemy.
In one sentence,
and to
those
let
words.
go of hate, right? I'm 100% positive of this. In your business, in your personal life, in all the things that you do, if you approach it with hatred, it's going to go wrong for you. You're not going to make it better. You're going to make it worse. Love is a state of mind. And that state of mind not only is about loving the other person, it's about loving yourself. It's about recognizing that they deserve forgiveness and you deserve forgiveness.
And in my work, I think that's the hardest part for a lot of people is forgiving themselves and learning to love themselves and allowing themselves to be loved by others. It takes so much bravery and courage to allow yourself to be vulnerable, to be open, to be seen, and then to have that opportunity to be loved.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think gratitude is way undervalued. And, I know personally in my own life, there's been so many times where there were blessings that were disguised as difficulties in my life. And it wasn't until I got through them that I realized that. But I think gratitude and really seeing the blessings that are in disguise.
Yeah, you actually live that one. It's kind of surprising to me. Everyone who knows you says the same thing. You express gratitude for even the smallest things that other people do for you. I've heard it a number of times. And is that just a habit that you formed?
I might be manipulating them to
Are
do
you
it again. No, I'm kidding. I'm not.
Well, actually, that makes sense,
It's
right?
masterful.
Whether it's manipulation or not. There's no doubt about this. I do think that gratitude ends up getting you that if you punish people, what they learn to do is to stay away from you. That's what they learn, right? And they learn, okay, when I am around them and I'm going to be punished, maybe they learn not to do it. But gratitude is the way that you try to encourage the actions that you want, as opposed to discouraging the actions that you don't want.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And you were talking about being with Krista at the end of her life and the gratitude that you experienced, just having that opportunity to be there for her and her gently asking you to stay.
One of the things that we did, and again, we'd long been divorced after this had happened. She was very, very stressed about the fact that her granddaughter and grandchildren wouldn't get to know her, wouldn't get to know who she was. So I sat down with her and I brought over a camera and I filmed hours and hours and hours of her asking her questions about what advice would she give to her granddaughters, what advice would she give to her grandsons, telling stories about her past life. And it was actually an amazingly, well, it was a really good thing for my grandkids and for my sons who were able to have those stories and to be able to have a piece of them. But even my listening to them, it was, just so amazing to sit there and listen to them and to recognize the gratitude that we just should have had for our life. I mean, you can definitely look back on it and say, oh my gosh, here are all the things that we lost. But you can also look back on it and say, here are all the things that we gained. Now, I'm going to go back to this destiny, fate thing. I don't quite know where destiny and fate played its role in it, but all the things that I thought that I wanted, that I thought I'd lost because I was becoming a father, it just wasn't true. I got all of them. I ended up becoming mayor of the city of Phoenix. I was able to run for office. I started my own business. I finished my degree at night. And I wouldn't trade my boys for anything. But in listening to those stories with her, I also wouldn't trade my time with her. It was a wonderful period of time, even though it was really hard. There were really hard components to it. Sometimes reviewing those stories and looking back on them help. But here's what I know. Had I started that with anger and hatred and resentment about what had happened and about her leaving me, I would have missed all of that.
Yeah, if you would have stayed blinded by your own misery, you would have missed these treasures and these opportunities, and to have that healing experience with her and to also be relieved of your own guilt.
Yeah. It's a little embarrassing to say that I haven't been successful in marriage, but I've been pretty successful in divorces. So.
Keeping a relationship, you mean, with the people that you divorced.
Well, anyway. So
you honor your
right.
commitments, Paul Johnson.
Yeah, there we go. So let's talk about some of the lessons. One of the things that I think is an important lesson is there's this clock. Right? There's this clock that swings in democracy. In China, that clock doesn't swing. Mm-hmm. In China, there is one person who's in charge, and he's telling them where they have to go. In Russia today with Putin, there's one person in charge, and he's telling them what the answer is. In democracy, because we focused on the individual, because we made the individual the supreme person, and because they buy into a variety of different sets of beliefs, that clock swings back and forth. It just does. All right. And our founders knew that it was going to swing back and forth. Now, if you swing that pendulum too far in either direction, you can break that beautiful clock. And that clock is the envy of the entire world. It just is. It has been. Democracy and a republic disappeared when Caesar crossed the Rubicon and came back into Rome. From that point on, it was gone. And, it's funny because a lot of times we look back on Caesar and we see him as being a great guy and he was turned on by Brutus and others. They turned on him because he had destroyed the republic, because he had destroyed democracy, and he had implemented an empire underneath an emperor, underneath a Caesar, underneath a person who was going to control their lives, right? Mm-hmm. From that point until 1776, there were no democracies. No republics, monarchies, and emperors ruled the entire world. We know that clock has to swing back and forth. One of the lessons is that ideology can destroy that clock, right? Mm-hmm. But more importantly, it destroys your life. It destroys who you are. It allows that evil that is inside of you, and good and evil. I agree with Solzhenitsyn that good and evil is in each one of us. With Carl Jung, who said that good and evil is in each one of us, that it allows that evil to escape and to do bad things. We have to gain control of it. We have to gain control of our emotions. We have to understand what it is that's important to us. We have to recognize that we shouldn't give up on the people that we love for people that we don't even know, who they really are, nor do they even care about us. Those, to me, are the lessons that begin to say, think about good and evil, think about where it comes from, understand the addictiveness of ideology, and most importantly, that you can always start over. But if you're going to do so, start with love.
Yeah, and it may be about fine-tuning your goals. I think, with COVID and everything kind of coming to a screeching halt, I saw that it gave many people an opportunity to reevaluate what is important in their life and what do they want out of their lives. And some people found that they were in loveless marriages and it was time to move on. And some people started a business because that was always what they felt passionate about. And we're saying you don't have to wait for an epidemic to reevaluate your life and make those life-altering changes. You can do that now. Mm-hmm. And it takes great courage, and you're going to have a gazillion reasons why you shouldn't do it, and you're going to feel extremely insecure and fearful about it. And there may be times that you'll be questioning your own mental state. I've done that. I've definitely been there, and I'm happy to share in other future episodes about my process. But if you don't take that risk, you're never going to know what you're capable of. You're never going to know who you really are. And you'll continue to be limited and not even really appreciate or understand what those constraints or limitations are, because you've participated in perpetuating them. Psychology gives us a lot of theory on thinking errors. And so the other suggestion I would have to our listeners is catch yourself when you're entering into your own mental traps. There's lots of different theories out there. I think the ones that are probably going to be the most beneficial, useful to mention today is confirmation bias. So we tend to look for things that help to support how we're feeling about a situation, and it could be supported based on our life experiences, but we tend to miss evidence that is contradictory to our beliefs because we wholeheartedly and we feel so passionate about it that we want to prove that we're right. And so you can miss all the other things that prove that you're not. And it's hard to see. And I think this is when, working with a professional can be helpful, talking through this with a trusted person, really asking for feedback, and again, really engaging in that self-discovery piece. Look for patterns, look for habits, start to unravel those and question them. Ask what drives you, and recreate meaning. Again, where the pursuit of happiness really is an inside job. I think by feeling and expressing and experiencing more gratitude, finding the blessings in your day-to-day experience. I remember one Holocaust survivor telling this really powerful story. She had to drag people who were deceased out into this huge pile, and she was a young woman at the time, and she was just asking God, why is this happening? Like, how is this in my existence right now? Like, how could you let this happen? And then all of a sudden she looked at one of the trees. Everything was just death was all around her. There was no signs of life, and she saw one tiny bud starting to bloom on the tree. She said it was the only sign of life in the concentration camp, and it wasn't shortly after that the Americans had come and liberated the camp. And she ended up marrying actually one of the Americans who came to liberate the camp. She has a powerful story, Magda Hertzberger. And it's beautiful, but she saw the blessing in that space. We give you these enriching examples throughout history, throughout time, my family, Paul's lived experiences, stories of people that I've been working with. They're powerful stories because they're so extreme. But people live these extremes in their life. And so we want you to also gain from them. These are treasures. Celebrate your treasures.
All right, Emily, thank you very much. This is Paul Johnson with The Optimistic American.